Welcome to today's event at the Swindon Festival of Literature, or rather the virtual online Swindon Festival of Literature. Many thanks for joining us. We do hope that everything is fine where you are. We are both pleased and grateful that human ingenuity, cutting-edge science, and digital technology make it possible for this show to go on, or at least to go on online. Now, today's guest author has written a book which is ostensibly a story about polar exploration gone wrong, but it becomes an exploration of communication, the stories we tell, how we tell them, and what happens when we can't tell them anymore. Today's guest interviewer loves a good read, I know that, and she thinks she has found just such a book in this one. Please join me in giving a Swindon Festival of Online Literature Festival welcome to guest interviewer Sara-Jane Arbury and our guest author, Costa award-winning writer, 3 times longlisted for the Booker Prize, and a professor of creative writing, Jon McGregor. Welcome to both of you.
Hello, hello.
Hello, it's good to be here.
Very nice you're here. Very nice you're here, but you're only here online. We'd love to have had you both live in Swindon, because Swindon in spring is pretty nice. In fact, have either of you or both of you ever been to Swindon?
I think I've been through Swindon. I've been to Devizes several times. I'm not sure I've ever stopped in Swindon, but I will do as soon as I can.
I have been to Swindon many times.
And I hope you enjoyed it, Sara-Jane.
I did. Fantastic place.
Terrific. Let's get back to the topic in hand, the book. Jon, your mysteriously titled book, Lean, Fall, Stand, with a comma after each word, an exploration of communication. Sara-Jane, Jon McGregor, please tell us more.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity for a conversation with Jon McGregor about his terrific new book, Lean, Fall, Stand. Matt is absolutely right that I look for a good read, and I was utterly gripped by this book. I read it in one sitting. Now, Jon, for the benefit of people who may not have read the book yet, would you tell us in your own words what Lean, Fall, Stand is about, please?
I can have a go. This is always something I find challenging when I finish writing a book, is to try and sum it up. But it's a book which starts in Antarctica, so that's a nice clear starting point. It starts with a group of 3 men who were there on a scientific research expedition. There's Doc, the older man who's the kind of technician field guide, for the 2 much younger characters, Luke and Thomas, who are mapping specialists, and they're there doing some mapping work in Antarctica, and it all goes terribly wrong. There's without giving too much away, that there's serious weather and some serious things happen, and Doc ends up back at home in Cambridge in need of sustained care from his family, and mostly from his wife Anna. And Anna, having been very kind of independent person and relished the times when Robert is away from home, is now kind of thrown into the role of full-time carer, which was never really on her agenda, and she has to make quite an abrupt adjustment. And so the book, kind of starting off being about the kind of bravery and heroism of Antarctica and the kind of wildlife there, switches into being about home life and recovery and illness and care and language, ultimately, because Doc loses most of his language once he's back home. So it's about how we communicate with people.
Okay, and can I ask, where did you get the idea for the story? I mean, what sparked your initial thoughts and made you want to write it?
There were lots and lots of sparks. I mean, the fundamental one was the fact that I went to Antarctica on a writing residency with the British Antarctic Survey, supported by the Arts Council, back in 2004. And went to Antarctica, spent some time with the scientists there, mostly on a research ship, and was supposed to write a book about it back then, and kind of have been considering that prospect ever since, and trying and failing to write a novel, and eventually writing a novel.
Yeah, I mean, actually, could you tell us more about that residency then? Because, I mean, if you sort of went there with a group of scientists, how did, and you being a writer, how did you sort of interact with each other? Because obviously you're there for a completely different reason to what they're there for. So can you just shed a bit more light on that?
Yeah, yeah, I can try. I mean, it was a long time ago, and it was a yeah. I mean, it was an amazing experience, and quite challenging experience in some ways. Um, it was my first experience of that kind of writing residency, that kind of situation where you're kind of placed with a group of people who are doing something very different, and you're there to observe, perhaps to participate, and to try and make some use of that experience. And that's quite a strange and difficult thing to do in itself. Um, and then to be doing that in an environment as different as Antarctica, and a working environment as intense as Antarctica is also challenging. So I spent a lot of time just talking to people, trying not to get in the way, trying to find out what people were doing. Um, it was a great crash course in oceanography and biology, and weather systems, and all that kind of stuff. Um, the whole experience was a bit odd because having arranged to spend a week or so on this ship traveling to the main Antarctic base, and then having planned a lot of activities and a lot of writing based around being on the base on the Antarctic Peninsula, the ship actually got stuck in the ice. Well, not stuck, but it was prevented from getting to the base by the ice. We spent about 4 or 5 weeks on the ship, kind of trying to get through the ice, and then giving up, and coming back to the Falklands, from where I then went home. So I never quite got to Antarctica. I never quite got to the places I was anticipating getting to. So the whole time I was there was spent in this kind of state of expectation and anticipation for something that never quite happened. And yet I came home and I had been to Antarctica. So there was this very odd kind of experience that I had to process, when I came back, um, which is one of the reasons why I struggled to write anything about it for a long time. Um, but the main reason I struggled to write about it was because it's really difficult to describe the landscape and the seascape of Antarctica. Um, it's really difficult to explain what an iceberg looks like, or to reference an iceberg without going into incredibly tedious detail about what it looks like, because it's such an alien place, it's such an alien landscape for most people, and most writing functions by reminding the reader of something they already know about. So
Hmm.
if you're writing about the Lake District, and you kind of the fells, the hills, the mountains, the lakes, people immediately get a set of references and a set of images in their mind, and you don't have to describe every kind of physical detail of what a fell looks like, or what a lake looks like. Whereas Antarctica is so different and so odd, and people don't have those references. Um, and so I found it very difficult to explain and to describe and to make meaningful, um, which is what writing is supposed to be. And so I was stuck for a long time.
That's really interesting to hear that, because obviously having a residency in Antarctica is so completely the opposite to any environment here. Can I ask you to read us an excerpt from the novel? I believe you have a piece that's actually set
Yeah.
in
Right.
Antarctica that you'd like to read to us.
Yes. So so when I once I did get over this kind of stuckness, and I started to envisage a storyline and some characters and a kind of world, everything I was writing about wasn't based on my experiences because I never set foot on the land. So I was on a ship. So a lot of what I learned about Antarctica came from reading, from looking at people's blogs, from looking at film footage and photographs. I think in a way that makes sense because the experience I had was a real life experience. And if I was going to write about that experience, it would make more sense to write a piece of nonfiction. And I wanted to have written an invented story. So it's kind of come from an imagined world. And so I'm just going to read you the first page of the novel where we get thrown right into the middle of a storm and a crisis. When the storm came in, it was unexpected, and Thomas Myers was dropped to his knees. The air darkened in the distance. There was a roar, and everything went white against him. It had a kind of violence he wasn't prepared for. He wrapped his arms around his head and lay flat on the ice to keep from being hurled away. His hand twitched instinctively towards his phone, although he knew there was no signal and his phone wasn't there. His clothes felt as though they were being torn from his body, the air sucked from his lungs. He had heard this described as like being inside a jet engine, as though people knew what being inside a jet engine was like. People said these things, but the words didn't always fit. The roar of it was everything. He had only his weight against the ice to know which way up he was in the world. He couldn't see the others. He couldn't see anything. The important thing was to stay calm and take stock of the situation. Remember the training. Find shelter or make shelter. Remain in place. Establish contact with other members of the party. Keep moving. Keep calm. There were contradictions in the training. It was difficult to think, with the weather scouring wildly around him.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, actually, that's great because that is the beginning of the novel. And I mean, I loved that. We enter the novel at a really high point in the drama. And, I love the fact you have the phrase, something was wrong, that just sort of moves in and out of this text, almost like an iceberg just floating around. And we as readers literally sploosh, to quote one of the characters in the Antarctic, we sploosh straight into the story. It really moves along at pace, Jon, and I just wanted to ask, when you did eventually write the novel, did you write it like that? Did you write it at speed, or was it a slow process when you got going?
No, it was a slow process. I mean, what one breakthrough that I had actually was that idea of pace and urgency, because for some reason I had this storyline in my head for a long time of these three men in a kind of very remote corner of a very remote continent, in trouble, and the storm and the drama and the ice flows and all of that was in my mind as a story. And for some reason, I was writing it from a kind of retrospective perspective. So these characters are much older and they're remembering something terrible that happened like 20 years ago, and inevitably that slows everything down if you've got people kind of sitting around reflecting on something. And I suddenly kind of just questioned why was that my instinct? Like why do I have these people kind of mournfully thinking about something from ages ago when you could actually put the reader right into the heart of the moment and have the urgency and the drama happening on the page, which is kind of an obvious thing to do, but it took me a while to get to it. So it wasn't a quick process by any means, but I knew the flavor that I was after, and I was kind of just looking for that immediacy and that urgency and that kind of quick movements between the three characters, who are separate. They're each isolated within the storm, and kind of moving between the three of them. I knew that was what I was going for, but it took a while to get there.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier at the beginning of this conversation, you mentioned issues of heroism, sort of being human. I mean, can you expand on that a little bit more as themes within the novel?
Yeah, I think I think one of the key things that interested me about Antarctica and about the history of people going to Antarctica, exploring, um, working there, the scientific research that happens there, the the whole kind of the logistics of people. There are people who live there kind of year round for years, a couple of years at a time, and all of the kind of support staff and the scientists. The, and there's a lot been written about that, and you can go right back to the kind of heroic age and the way that Scott and Shackleton and Apsley Garrard wrote about their experiences. And then you get people in the kind of 40s and 50s writing about their experiences, Richard E. Byrd, Vivian Fuchs. Um, and then more recently, 70s, 80s, 90s, and this century, you get people writing about a very different kind of modern experience. Um, and all of that reading, as well as the people I spoke to when I was there, really got me thinking about ideas of, uh, images of heroism, images of self-sufficiency, images of independence and sacrifice, and a kind of slight, well, the quite significant mismatch sometimes between what people think they're doing when they go somewhere like that and are gone for a long time, and what's happening meanwhile back at home.
Mm.
And I was very interested in men who think they're being heroic, men who think they're being brave, men who think they are, um, especially men who think they're being self-sufficient when they're really not. There's a whole package, there's a whole world of support going into the things that they're doing, um, that they somehow think they're doing on their own. Um, and I was really interested in that, and really interested in thinking about men's kind of self-image and the way they kind of the image that they try and give to the world. Um, and so that becomes most kind of focused in this character of Doc, the older man, um, who spent a long time kind of going to Antarctica every year, spending months there, um, while his wife Anna is looking after their children at home, um, and the role that she then gets thrown into of having to care for him when he comes back home and he's injured, um, and the way that he can no longer be the image that he had of himself as being self-sufficient, and he has to depend on her, and she's kind of thrown into that role of having him be dependent on her, and has to has to get on with it whether she likes it or not. And
Mm.
so that for me, that became one of the key focuses of the book, and the key kind of focus of my thinking about these people and what was happening to them.
Yeah, because I mean, in a way, Doc and what's happening in Antarctica is sort of a navigation into the unknown, really. And then when he comes back, as you say, after his injury, and Anna has to care for him, she's navigating her way through the unknown. I actually found Anna a really quite complex woman, a complex character,
Mm-hmm.
a complex wife, and I just wondered, when you were writing her, how did you want her to be perceived in the minds of readers? I mean, was she a difficult character to write to get that balance right? I'll just say actually that there was a quote that I thought was just summed up her situation. She'd forgotten what to do with free time. And I thought that said so much about her life now with
Yeah.
Robert. And I just wondered if you could then just tell us a little bit more about the character of Anna and how you formed her.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I never know. I'm never able to articulate where a character has come from and how they've developed. I do know, I do that I'm very fond of her as a character, and I enjoyed writing her, and I kind of latched on. I remember latching on quite early on to the sort of person that she is, and whereas Robert has very immediate kind of neurological difficulties with language in his injured state. There's a lot of language that he can't access. Anna has very kind of subtle difficulties with language and communication, and there are things that she doesn't quite understand about the way people are communicating with her. She finds non-verbal communication a bit opaque. She doesn't always understand jokes, and I remember pinpointing that quite early, and quite enjoying kind of playing with that and playing with ideas about who she could be. And yeah, I mean, I'm really glad to hear you say that she seems complicated to you, because that's kind of always my mission in a book, is to make people as complicated as possible, because that's who people are, and that's one of the things that I find. If I find a novel disappointing, it's because the characters aren't complicated enough. It's because they're there to kind of fulfill a role within the story rather than be their own people. Um, so yeah, I tried to make her complicated.
Yeah.
I don't know how readers will perceive her, and I don't know how I want readers to perceive her, but I've got quite a clear picture of who she is, and I hope.
Yeah, I think I quite like. I mean, I like she doesn't settle easily into her roles. As a wife, as a mother, as a carer. And I just really liked that she's not a type, as it were. She's not somebody who just moves the action forward. She has her own story, and it's complex, and she questions herself and what's going on, and through her you question what their lives have become, which I've really enjoyed in the novel.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear. Yeah, I mean, she's somebody who she wasn't planning to get married, and she kind of not stumbled into it, but that happened, and she kind of had a bargain with Robert, that this marriage was going to be okay because he was going to be away quite a lot, and that seemed quite logical to her, and that's proceeded on that basis, and she wasn't planning to be a carer, but she doesn't really have a choice now. That's just what is happening, and she's kind of managing that. And yeah, I think often, not often, sometimes in novels, characters, one of the other things I find disappointing is that characters can be types. That's one problem. But also sometimes characters can be full of self-determination and agency, and they're going to do the thing that they have to do. And often in life, people just get a bit stuck in situations that are not what where they want to be, but they just have to kind of make the most of that and get on with it. And maybe further down the line, they'll be able to take control of their lives and go in a different direction, and maybe they won't. And to
Yeah.
me, those are really interesting situations when people are a little bit stuck. I think Anna's a bit stuck.
Would you read us another excerpt from the book, John? I believe you have an excerpt which features Anna.
Yeah. So again, this is from the beginning of her section. Really, this is where we first meet Anna. And tellingly, we first meet her when she's being told about Robert. It's Robert. It's your husband. I'm sorry to wake you. We need you to come. The phone was buzzing on the bedside table. She answered it before she was quite awake. It's Robert, Anna. Something's happened. We need you to. There was a crack in the curtains. The sky was dark. The man was talking about flights and passports. Years she'd waited for something like this, her imagination churning in the months he was away. It was almost a relief now, a bloody-minded satisfaction in getting it over with. She called Bridget before she did anything. It's Robert. Sorry, I know it's early. Something's happened. They want me to go down there. Is he okay? He's in the hospital. In Santiago. They're saying a stroke. They want me there. I don't know what I should do. Oh God, Anna, just go. Just get there. Worry about everything else later. Just go. She left quickly. She locked the front door. She left a coffee cup on the table. She packed clothes for warm weather. She packed her laptop and work diary, her passport, her phone, her purse. She wrote down the booking numbers for the tickets. She turned the heating off. It was still dark when the taxi arrived. Dawn was starting to happen somewhere way off in the east, shining against the ditches and flooded fields. In the taxi, for some reason, she thought about Tim's funeral, years earlier. The children had been much younger then. There had been discussion about whether they should come. They'll need to learn what these things are about sooner or later. I think before they can walk is rather soon. She wanted to be there for Bridget. She didn't want to have to look after them. I'll make sure they don't bother you. They'll be fine. They really won't, though. In the end, her parents had the children, and she and Robert went to the funeral on their own. She didn't know what had reminded her. The rough fabric of the car seat, the smell of the air freshener, the way the taxi driver wouldn't stop talking. He was telling her this route might seem longer, but it would avoid the traffic queuing to get onto the M11. She'd be surprised how early the traffic built up these days. Was she going anywhere nice?
Thank you. Thank you. And I mean, that kind of leads me on really to my next sort of the sort of theme that I'd like to talk with you about is language. I liked the fact that Sunday Times describes you as a writer alive to the lithe life of language. I have to be careful when I say that. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but I absolutely agreed with that. For me, when I was reading it, it's an incredibly poetic novel. I found, the language is unpredictable in places, and even the way the text is laid out on the page made me feel I was reading, in a sense, sometimes a prose poem. Because the text is laid out in those sort of short paragraphs, particularly in the scenes in Antarctica, and it's almost like the text is floating against the white, so the whiteness of the page plays a part in the novel. And I just wondered whether or not that was, how uppermost in your mind was that, the sort of the poetry of the language, the words that you use, and even how it's set out on the page. Do you have a background in poetry at all, John?
No, but language is definitely something I've always, obviously I'm a writer, so I'm always thinking about language, but I think in my writing I've always been really interested in the way that the language, the sentences can communicate the story as much as the story itself, and the way that the sound of the language can do some of the work for the reader, and the rhythm of the sentences, and the layout on the page. And I think specifically in Antarctica, one of the key kind of part of the aesthetic is space. It's a place of vast empty space, and quietness and stillness, when there isn't a storm, and so even to the extent of having those kind of spaces in the text and those empty spaces on the page felt like an important part of communicating what was happening for those three characters in Antarctica. Whereas when we get to Anna's section and she's having to rush to the hospital in Santiago, she's having to deal with everything that's going on in terms of Robert's recovery and getting him back home again. Everything's very hectic and very busy, and the paragraphs are very full and dense, and kind of one thing kind of happens on top of another. So yeah, that's really important. And then of course the whole book itself essentially is about what happens when we lose language. And so Robert has his stroke and is affected with aphasia, which is the loss of language, and so everything is kind of geared towards what that means and how that plays out for him and for Anna.
Yeah, I was going to ask that actually. Is that his experience and others as well in a similar predicament to him feels so convincing and authentic. Did you, again, going back to the idea of research really, did you speak to health professionals, therapists? Did you visit support groups? Or how did you prepare to write Doc's character following his stroke?
So I did quite a lot of reading about stroke and about aphasia. And I was really lucky to be put in touch with several very helpful stroke and language therapists in Nottingham, where I live, and yeah, and other people involved in stroke recovery. And I also um, went along to an aphasia like self-help group here in Nottingham. For nearly a year, I went along to their monthly um, conversation meetings, and I was made really welcome by them. It was great. It was about a dozen people meeting once a month, um, having coffee and biscuits, and trying to talk about things. You know, one month they talk about holidays, another month they talk about music, and getting to know those people and getting to know those people as people, you know, rather than as people with aphasia. They're just people with their experiences, and their very, very different experiences of aphasia. Aphasia is a condition that has lots and lots of different versions, I guess, iterations. You know, people can have cognitive difficulties and semantic difficulties and difficulties expressing, difficulties understanding, um, and all of those things can kind of intersect and overlap in quite complicated ways. And so being able to spend time with people and understand what that means for them in terms of communication, and how people find other ways of communicating, um, and you know, being able to get to know people, even though I wasn't really, you know, in some cases wasn't really having any substantial conversation with them at all. I still felt like I was getting to know them. Um, was a real privilege, and was really quite a moving experience. Um, and so I drew on a lot of that experience, and I drew on the way I often work, which is to write something badly or wrong, show it to people who know, have them set me straight, and then try again. You know, as often goes that way around, because partly because I want the characters and the stories to be my invention, and then I want the kind of the context to be right. And I think sometimes if you spend too much time doing all of the research first, you end up kind of rewriting the stories that you've heard rather than telling your own stories. Um, but yeah, I was helped by a lot of people for this, and it felt really important because it's aphasia is something that's not very much written about, talked about, known about. Um, so it felt like a bit of a responsibility to try and get it right.
Yeah, I mean, you were saying earlier that you never actually made it to Antarctica.
Mm.
But so you were relying on looking at documentary films and research like that. And yet the research that you've done for, for Robert and, well, Doc and his stroke and what have you after that, was much more people centred. And I wonder whether or not that influenced the way you wrote those sections, essentially the Antarctica sections and then the Cambridge sections, whether or not the nature of the research that you'd done had some bearing on the way you wrote those parts of the novel.
To an extent, yeah, and I think it also reflects the kind of shift in my interest in a way. I kind of, you know, the first third of the novel, which is set in Antarctica in the storm and is about the relationship between these three men, um, was originally going to be the entire novel, and there was a lot more material and a lot more ideas and a lot more storyline was kind of going into the development of that, and I just became much more interested in, okay, they're fine. Those three guys are down there in the ice doing their thing, but actually, what about all these other people back at home? And then once I kind of when I kind of landed on the aphasia and the loss of language because of this problem I was having with not being able to describe the landscape in Antarctica and not being able to describe the physical experience of being in Antarctica, and that inability to describe something really kind of got me thinking about what language is and what it does and what it achieves in terms of how we relate to people. And that was what got me really interested in aphasia, and that kind of took over for me in terms of my drive to write the novel. Yeah, so that's where that came from, really.
Okay, and then just talking about actually your writing, as a novelist. I mean, you're professor of creative writing at the University of Nottingham. I'm interested to know, how does that fit in with your own creative writing? I mean, how do you find the time and space for your own creativity?
It's a very good question. Sometimes with difficulty, I think. Sometimes, I mean, I love teaching at the university, and I find it really rewarding to be able to think about what I'm doing and what my process is, in order to talk to students about that, and having to kind of really articulate what I'm doing for other people, I think kind of feeds into my own process, my own craft. But also, it's really rewarding to work with a student on a piece of writing and to help them to see where they can improve it, how they can think about how they improve it, what they want to do with it next. So yeah, I really enjoy it in itself. On the other hand, it's really difficult. It's a part-time job, and so writing has become a part-time job, and it's really difficult to move from one to the other. I mean, I think anyone who's got part-time jobs knows that it can be a challenge to balance different roles and different work. And I find it quite difficult to kind of be answering a whole lot of emails in the morning and then suddenly writing creatively in the afternoon. But it's fine. I find a way.
Yeah.
I find chunks of time, and I think on the whole, having an actual job is probably good for me.
Okay, and finally, my last question, John. The time has just flown by. I'd just like to ask you what your next writing project is. Have you got any other books or even ideas in the pipeline?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I have got several ideas flying around for competing for attention, and none of them have a name or a description. They're just kind of vague inklings at the moment. So yeah, I think at the moment I'm going to concentrate on talking about this book, and then in a few months' time get back to work.
Thank you, John. I mean, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today. I couldn't wait to talk to you after I'd read the book, Thank you for sharing your thoughts so generously with us. And I have to say, if you haven't read this book, please do. It is a really utterly immersive, gripping read. Thank you very much, John. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And as I was sitting here listening but not joining in, I kept wanting to join in, not only because the main character is called Anna and my daughter's called Anna, and every time you said Anna, I wanted to say yes, but or something, but also because of what Sara-Jane's questions revealed, John, and what you said. And I kept thinking of If Nobody Speaks of Remarkable Things, your first book, which we absolutely loved in Swindon, and we couldn't get you because you were just winning awards all over the place, but we absolutely loved it. And especially memorable were two things that appear to be similar in your latest, and that is dealing with something that's very ordinary. You're interested in something that's very ordinary, that is almost imperceptible and is generally sort of left aside. It's not heroic, it's not big, it's not out there. And then the other thing is this thing that Sara-Jane mentioned of your language being like poetry. And when she quoted the live love of live language, or whatever that was, that tongue twister. But that was also said, and I remember people in our reading group saying the same thing about If Nobody Speaks of Remarkable Things. And my question is, I wonder, and and it's to do with the last question from Sara-Jane, in your role as a professor of creative writing, whether you actually direct students, I mean, I'm sure you don't tell them what to do, but whether you direct them towards a sort of what might be called a literary language, something that is slightly more poetic than prosaic, and whether you also steer them towards looking at the ordinary and not worrying about the big stuff, or do you say, find your own voice and get on with it? What do you do, Jon?
Somewhere in between those two. I think it's really important. I don't really try to teach creative writing. I try to teach people how to read their own writing and understand what they're trying to do and find ways of doing it better, more clearly or more effectively. Um, and so when I'm talking to a student about their work, I'm trying to get them to articulate a sense of what they were trying to do with that piece of writing, and that won't necessarily be poetic description or snappy dialogue or whatever it is, pacey drama. Whatever it is they're trying to do, I want to help them find ways of doing that more effectively, and reading their own work clearly, and with understanding is really difficult, and that's the thing I concentrate on trying to help people get to.
Thanks very much, Jon. And one of the things that we celebrate at the Festival of Literature, of course, is reading. And it's amazing how over the years, as a result of that, people have emerged who want to write as well, as a result of reading. The right way round, it seems to me. Do you think, Sara-Jane and Jon, reading is a good thing?
Yes, is the short answer.
Yeah, I think, and whenever students and anybody asks me about learning to write, my main answer is to tell them to read more books, read more widely, read more deeply. If they find a writer that they like, to kind of read all of that writer's work, read the people who influence that writer and have been influenced by that. Just read voraciously, because that's the best way of. I mean, language is imitation. That's fundamentally what it is, and so reading, kind of writing, always comes in the footsteps of reading.
Yeah, we're on the shoulders of giants. Jon, long we had not talked, terrific. The Swindon Festival of Literature thanks you, Sara-Jane Arbury, for returning to Swindon, if only online, to be a great interviewer. But most of all, a Swindon Festival of Literature thank you to you, Jon McGregor. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you. I hope to get to Swindon in real life one day soon.